consistent with what an ecumenical council is that the decrees of an ecumenical council are the decrees as promulgated by the Pope in Rome, right? Peter teaching in the midst of the bishops, in the midst of the whole church, but that as the decrees are promulgated by Rome is how we have accepted them, how the church has accepted them. In the East, where the role of the emperor from early on was stressed much more than ever was in the East, much more than ever was in the West, there's a pointing back to this, and this kind of gets brought out again and again, and it becomes a issue that over time is a wedge issue that tears at the communion between East and West. So Pope Leo II, who was the Pope at the time of this council, he changes the wording to read that Honorius, he allowed the Immaculate Faith to be perverted, not that he taught heresy. So that the distinction is our understanding of papal infallibility, this will come out towards the end of our lecture series when we get to Vatican I, is that the Pope is preserved from teaching heresy, okay? It is kind of a negative claim, not that that he has this gift of prophecy to say every bit that is true about everything that might potentially be related to matters of revelation at any given time, but that what he speaks is not erroneous, when he speaks in the official capacity from the chair, so to speak. And it does not say that the Pope is always prudent in matters of what have you. That prudence is not included under this understanding. So sometimes things might not happen in the most diplomatic, the best possible light. It just means that it's preserved from teaching error. And so the changing in the wording here, and actually going back to Honorius' letter, it is one that cautions silence on the matter. Because, first of all, the full implication of what was being battered about was not known. And likewise, Patriarch Sergius is kind of insincere in what he presents to the Pope, Pope Honorius, asking his opinion. He's the one who started the issue, and then is saying, well, you know, there's just these disputes, we need you to tell us to be quiet. So what Pope Leo II does is effectively say that Pope Honorius failed in his diligence by allowing the Immaculate Faith to be perverted. And he will say this when he sends out his, yes?
I was wondering if you could just repeat again how the phrase was originally submitted about Pope Honorius.
Oh, how was it? Let's see. He was, well, I didn't write the word for word, but he was condemned at the end of the string of patriarchs from Constantinople who were condemned for teaching monothelitism, right? His name is tagged on at the end of that. And Pope Honorius of Rome, who basically, in that original canon, it says something like for adhering to the heresy in his letter.
Okay.
So, but if you look at the letter, it is clear that there are two natures in Christ. I mean, that comes out clearly. The whole issue of whether there is one at the point where he wrote this letter, this becomes kind of into the minutia of history. But sometimes you have to dig into the details to remove the devil, right? At this point in history, the issue was not over whether there was one will in Christ, but whether there was one action in Christ, which is more, what does that mean, right? It was very shortly after he wrote the response that the response was used to move the argument further to the one will. Does that make sense? So by the fact that he did not expand in his letter the implications of the teaching of two wills, and said, yeah, I agree with you. Just keep quiet on the issue. We don't need this to be brought up. One action, two actions in Christ, this is an obscure thing. Just be quiet about it. That allowed the heresy and it provided grounds for it to spread. Does that make sense? Okay. And so when Pope Leo II sends out a letter to the other bishops in the western part of Europe, in North Africa, he attaches a letter, and it was preserved by the King of Spain at the time. And says that Honorius had been condemned, quote, for negligence in not denouncing the heresy, and for using an expression which the heretics were able to employ to advance their cause, thereby allowing the faith to be stained. So he's very careful in saying, in not attributing the preaching and the adherence of heresy to him. In the East, however, monothelitism would not die immediately. If you notice, after most of these councils, the problems don't go away. Sometimes they actually get much worse. This one, it lasted a little bit longer. It wasn't nearly as bad as Chalcedon or Nicea, where it blows up and gets much worse than it ever was before the council. This one dies out more or less in the middle of the next century. Now, by the mid-680s, there is this short period of peace in the church, between East and West, and it kind of comes to an end when the Emperor Constantine IV dies in 685. His successor, his son, takes the name Justinian II and models himself after the megalomaniac from the 6th century, and thinking that he's going to achieve all the great things that his namesake has done. And one of the things Justinian did back in the 500s is that he had a renewal of the civil code of law, kind of collecting all the laws from going back centuries, standardizing them, codifying them all, and Justinian II says, I'm going to do the same for canon law for the church. And part of this is to reflect the new reality that is affecting the Byzantine Empire, and that is affecting the church in many places. So Muslim domination now going into 50, 60 years, so getting into the third generation of people living under Muslim rule, and how that the old canons of the church don't have that fully in consideration. So he wants to change, update the canon law. If you remember, that was the reason for the calling of the Second Vatican Council, to update canon law, a pastoral council. So this is the pastoral council from the first millennium. And it is a controversial one because it was never accepted in the West. It is called the Quinisext, or sometimes the Council in Trullo, because that's where, in Constantinople, that's where it took place. Now, it was held in the year 692, and there were 211 bishops from the East were present, as were the 4 Eastern patriarchs and the papal ambassador to Constantinople. The canons began with a profession of faith and a recognition of the previous 6 councils. And it itself did not, this council, it saw itself as not a different council, but just the one completing the work of Constantinople II and Constantinople III, because they never wrote any disciplinary canons. If you remember from Nicea I and Constantinople I and Chalcedon, there were canons, the disciplinary canons, that said how long penances should be, and that monasteries had to do this and couldn't do that, and bishops had to call a synod every year, a metropolitan synod every year. That one seems to be repeated every time there's an ecumenical council, pointing to the fact that they never do it, apparently. They have to be reminded that they're supposed to do it. So this was the reason they say for calling this council. Now, one of the things, it passed 102 different canons, so by far more than had been in any of the previous ones. 85 of these were